Today's case takes us into the fascinating world of Egyptian archaeology, where ancient secrets and modern murder collide in the most impossible way. But before we dive into this intriguing mystery, let me ask you this. What if I told you that a man could be murdered at 11:30 p.m., yet every witness swore they saw him alive at midnight? Keep that impossible timeline in mind as we explore the Archaeologist's lost tomb. My name is Inspector William Hartley, and I've seen many impossible crimes in my 37 years of investigating London's most perplexing cases. But standing in Professor Edmund Blackthorne's locked study on that cold November morning in 1925, staring at his body surrounded by priceless Egyptian artifacts, I faced a puzzle that challenged the very laws of physics. The victim had died at exactly 11:30 p.m., but every witness swore he'd been alive and speaking to them at midnight. What if I told you that a man could be murdered at 11:30 p.m., yet every witness swore they saw him alive at midnight? That an ancient Egyptian tomb could hold the key to solving a modern crime. In November of 1925, I encountered the most impossible timeline I've ever investigated, where the secrets of the pharaohs and the precision of modern murder collided in a way that defied all logic. The November fog had settled thick over Bloomsbury that evening, turning the gas lamps into dim halos of yellow light and muffling the sounds of London's evening traffic. Professor Edmund Blackthorne's Georgian townhouse at 47 Russell Square stood like a monument to Victorian scholarship, its windows glowing warmly against the grey murk. For 30 years this house had served as both residence and private museum for one of Britain's most distinguished Egyptologists, a man whose discoveries had filled the halls of the British Museum, and whose scholarly reputation stretched from Oxford to Cairo. I had been summoned there at dawn by a telephone call from Dr. Margaret Fairfax, Professor Blackthorne's research assistant and the person who had discovered his body. Her voice had been steady but strained as she reported what she had found in his locked study, a scene that would challenge everything I thought I understood about murder, time, and the impossibility of being in two places at once. The house itself told the story of a life devoted to uncovering the secrets of ancient Egypt. As I climbed the front steps, I could see through the tall windows glimpses of sarcophagi, canopic jars, and papyrus scrolls arranged with museum-quality precision. Professor Blackthorne had been more than just an archaeologist. He had been a collector, a scholar, and according to some, an obsessive man who valued ancient treasures more than modern relationships. Dr. Fairfax met me at the door, a woman of perhaps 35, with the kind of intellectual intensity that marked serious scholars. She wore practical clothes and wire-rimmed spectacles, but her hands trembled slightly as she led me through the foyer lined with Egyptian statuary. "Inspector Hartley," she said, her voice carefully controlled, "I must warn you that what you're about to see is unusual." Professor Blackthorne was found in his private study, the door locked from the inside, the key still in the lock on our side. But that's not the strangest part. Till we climbed a narrow staircase, lined with photographs from archaeological expeditions, images of desert camps, excavation sites, and groups of scholars posing proudly beside their discoveries. Professor Blackthorne appeared in many of them, a tall, distinguished man, with piercing eyes, and the kind of confident bearing that comes from a lifetime of making important discoveries. "Tell me about last night," I said as we reached the second-floor landing. "When did you last see Professor Blackthorne alive?" Dr. Fairfax paused, her expression troubled. "That's just it, Inspector. According to Dr. Morrison from the British Museum, Professor Blackthorne's time of death was approximately 11:30 p.m., but I spoke with him at midnight. So did at least 3 other people." An impossible timeline. Either Dr. Morrison's medical examination was wrong, or multiple witnesses were lying, or we were dealing with something that defied the natural order of time itself. Stop and think about this. How can a man be dead at 11:30 p.m. and alive at midnight? In my experience, the laws of physics don't bend for murderers. But what if the killer had found a way to manipulate time itself, or at least our perception of it? The study door stood open now, though Dr. Fairfax assured me it had been locked when she discovered the body at 8 o'clock that morning. The room beyond was a treasure trove of Egyptian antiquities, hieroglyphic tablets, golden figurines, painted coffin lids, and rolls of papyrus arranged with scholarly precision. But dominating the space was Professor Blackthorne's massive desk, behind which his body still sat in a high-backed leather chair. Dr. Morrison looked up as we entered, his face grave in the morning light filtering through tall windows. As police surgeon, Morrison had examined hundreds of crime scenes, but something about this one clearly troubled him. "Inspector," he said, stepping aside to reveal the body, "Professor Blackthorne died from a single stab wound to the chest, delivered with surgical precision between the ribs, directly into the heart. The weapon appears to have been thin and sharp, possibly an Egyptian ceremonial dagger, given the collection surrounding us." Professor Edmund Blackthorne sat slumped in his chair, a man of perhaps 60 years, whose scholarly bearing was evident even in death. His grey hair was neatly combed, his evening clothes impeccable, except for the dark stain spreading across his white shirt. His hands rested on the desk blotter, and his eyes stared sightlessly at an open papyrus scroll spread before him. But it was the papyrus itself that caught my immediate attention. Written in hieroglyphics, with modern English translation notes in the margins, it appeared to be some kind of ancient warning or prophecy. The professor's own handwriting was visible in the margins, translating phrases like "Death comes to those who disturb the sleep of the divine," and "The curse of Ankh-Toi shall follow the desecrated to his final breath." "Dr. Morrison," I said, examining the wound more closely, "you're certain about the time of death?" "As certain as medical science allows, Inspector. Rigor mortis, body temperature, and other physical indicators all point to death occurring between 11:15 and 11:45 p.m. I'd stake my professional reputation on 11:30 p.m. as the most likely moment." But Dr. Fairfax had already told me that she had spoken with Professor Blackthorne at midnight, which meant either Morrison was wrong, she was lying, or we were dealing with something beyond normal criminal investigation. "Dr. Fairfax," I said, settling into the chair across from the professor's desk, "I need you to tell me exactly what happened last night. Every detail, no matter how insignificant it might seem." She sat carefully in a chair beside one of the sarcophagi, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Professor Blackthorne had been working late, as he often did when he was excited about a new discovery. He'd just returned from Egypt with some remarkable finds: papyrus scrolls, jewelry, and a sealed canopic jar that he believed might contain important historical documents. "What sort of documents?" "Maps, Inspector. Ancient maps that might lead to an undiscovered tomb." Professor Blackthorne believed he had found references to a burial site that had never been excavated, possibly containing treasures that would rival Tutankhamun's tomb. Maps to an undiscovered tomb. In the world of archaeology, such a discovery would be worth millions of pounds and guarantee immortal fame for whoever made the find. It would also provide a powerful motive for theft and murder. "You said you spoke with him at midnight. Where were you at that time?" "In the library downstairs, cataloging some pottery fragments we'd brought back from Cairo." Professor Blackthorne called down to me from his study. I could hear his voice clearly through the speaking tube he'd had installed between the rooms. "What did he say?" "He was excited about something he'd discovered in the papyrus. He said he'd found the key to locating the tomb, but that he needed to verify some translations before he could be certain. He asked me to bring him his copy of Gardner's Egyptian grammar from the library." "And did you take it to him?" "I gathered the book and climbed the stairs, but when I reached his study door, I found it locked. I knocked and called out, but there was no response. I assumed he'd become absorbed in his work and didn't want to be disturbed." Professor Blackthorne could be single-minded when he was pursuing a discovery. A locked door, no response to knocking, yet the professor supposedly alive and calling down to her just minutes before. The timeline was becoming more impossible by the moment. Who else claimed to have contact with Professor Blackthorne after 11:30 p.m.? Lord Pemberton telephoned at 5 minutes to midnight. I answered the telephone myself. He spoke with Professor Blackthorne for several minutes about arrangements for tomorrow's meeting at the British Museum. Lord Pemberton, I recognized the name. A wealthy collector and patron of archaeological expeditions, a man with enough influence to fund entire excavations, and enough money to acquire whatever artifacts he desired. Dr. Fairfax, is it possible that someone else answered that telephone call? Someone impersonating Professor Blackthorne? She considered this carefully. I suppose it's theoretically possible, Inspector, but Professor Blackthorne had a very distinctive voice, deep, educated, with particular mannerisms of speech. Lord Pemberton has known him for 15 years. I find it hard to believe he could have been fooled. Think about this impossible puzzle. A man dead at 11:30 p.m., yet speaking on the telephone at midnight, ancient maps worth millions, and a locked room with no way in or out. How do you solve a murder that defies time itself? If you're enjoying this complex mystery, don't forget to subscribe for daily detective stories that challenge your mind. Leave a comment with your theory. How could someone appear to be alive after they were already dead? Now, let's examine the crime scene more carefully. I spent the next hour examining Professor Blackthorne's study with the methodical attention to detail that had served me well in dozens of complex investigations. The room was large and well appointed, lined floor to ceiling with books on Egyptology, and filled with artifacts that would have been the envy of any museum curator. But it was the desk area that held the most interesting clues. The papyrus scroll that Professor Blackthorne had been reading was indeed ancient. I could see that even with my limited knowledge of Egyptian antiquities, but more importantly, there were fresh ink stains on the blotter where someone had been making notes, and a magnifying glass positioned as if the professor had been examining specific hieroglyphic symbols just before his death. Dr. Fairfax, I said, pointing to the translation notes in the margins, these appear to be Professor Blackthorne's handwriting. When would he have made these annotations? Yesterday evening, most likely. He'd been working on that particular scroll since his return from Egypt 3 days ago. He was convinced it contained the key to finding a lost tomb, but the language was archaic and difficult to translate. I studied the hieroglyphic text more carefully. Even to my untrained eye, it was clear that this was no ordinary historical document. The symbols were arranged in patterns that suggested mathematical precision, and Professor Blackthorne's notes referenced geographical coordinates and astronomical alignments. What exactly did Professor Blackthorne discover in Egypt? You mentioned maps and a sealed canopic jar. The expedition was funded by Lord Pemberton and supervised by the British Museum, Dr. Fairfax explained. We were excavating a minor tomb near Saqqara when Professor Blackthorne discovered a hidden chamber that appeared to contain administrative records from the reign of Ankh-Taw'i, a little-known pharaoh from the 5th dynasty, and this pharaoh's tomb has never been found. Precisely. Most Egyptologists assumed his burial site had been lost or destroyed centuries ago, but the documents Professor Blackthorne discovered suggested that Ankh-Taw'i's tomb was deliberately hidden, sealed with curses and magical protections that were considered powerful even by ancient Egyptian standards. Ancient curses and magical protections. It sounded like the sort of superstitious nonsense that I normally dismissed without a second thought. But standing in this room, filled with artifacts from a civilization that had mastered astronomy, mathematics, and engineering, while most of Europe was still living in mud huts, I found myself wondering if the ancient Egyptians might have possessed knowledge that we had lost. Dr. Fairfax, I need to speak with Lord Pemberton about his telephone conversation last night. Where can I reach him? He maintains a private museum in his Belgravia mansion, but he spends most of his time at the British Museum. Professor Blackthorne was scheduled to meet with him this morning to discuss the expedition findings, a meeting that would now never take place. But I suspected that Lord Pemberton's telephone call might hold the key to understanding how Professor Blackthorne could appear to be alive 30 minutes after his death. As I prepared to leave the study, something caught my eye that I had missed in my initial examination. On the floor beside Professor Blackthorne's chair lay a small golden amulet, partially hidden beneath some scattered papers. I picked it up carefully, noting its weight and the intricate craftsmanship of its design. Dr. Fairfax, have you seen this before? She examined the amulet closely, her expression growing puzzled. It's beautiful work, 5th Dynasty, I would guess, based on the style, but I don't recognize it from our recent expedition. Professor Blackthorne must have had it in his private collection, but as I studied the amulet more carefully, I noticed something that made me reconsider that assumption. The gold was bright and untarnished, showing none of the patina that would be expected from a 4000-year-old artifact. Either this was a recent acquisition that Professor Blackthorne had been examining, or it was a modern reproduction made to look ancient. Dr. Fairfax, is it possible that someone has been creating forgeries of Egyptian artifacts? Someone with access to Professor Blackthorne's collection and knowledge of ancient techniques? Her face grew pale as she considered the implications. You're suggesting that Professor Blackthorne might have been involved in fraud? Inspector, his reputation was impeccable. He would never have participated in anything dishonest. But reputation and integrity, I had learned, could be very different things. And the discovery of potentially forged artifacts in the study of a murdered Egyptologist suggested motives that went far beyond simple burglary or academic rivalry. Consider this. If Professor Blackthorne had discovered that someone was forging Egyptian artifacts using his expertise and reputation, he would have been in a position to expose a conspiracy worth millions of pounds. And if that someone was desperate enough to kill to protect their secret, well, that might explain both the murder and the elaborate deception around the time of death. The British Museum on Great Russell Street was, as always, bustling with scholars, tourists, and researchers pursuing their various investigations into human history. I had visited many times over the years, both for pleasure and in the course of official business, but I never failed to be impressed by the vast scope of knowledge contained within its walls. Lord Pemberton maintained a private office in the Egyptian department, a privilege granted to major benefactors of the museum's expeditions and acquisitions. I found him there that afternoon, a distinguished man of perhaps 55 years, with the kind of refined bearing that comes from generations of inherited wealth and social position. "Inspector Hartley," he said, rising from behind a desk covered with archaeological photographs and expedition reports. "Dr. Fairfax telephoned to tell me about poor Blackthorne. Shocking business. Absolutely shocking. One of our finest scholars, and such a senseless tragedy. Lord Pemberton, I understand you spoke with Professor Blackthorne by telephone last night. Can you tell me about that conversation?" "Certainly, Inspector. I called at precisely 5 minutes to midnight. I remember checking my pocket watch. Blackthorne was excited about some discovery he'd made in the papyrus documents we'd brought back from Egypt. He said he'd found what he called the key to Ankh-Towi's secret." "How did he sound during this conversation? Was his voice normal?" "Completely normal, Inspector. Perhaps a bit more excited than usual, but that was typical. When Blackthorne was on the verge of a significant discovery, we arranged to meet this morning to examine the documents together and plan our next expedition." Lord Pemberton's account matched what Dr. Fairfax had told me, but it still didn't explain how Professor Blackthorne could have been speaking on the telephone 30 minutes after his death, unless Lord Pemberton, how well did you know Professor Blackthorne's voice? Would you have been able to detect if someone else was impersonating him? He looked startled by the suggestion. Inspector, I've known Edmund Blackthorne for 15 years. We've traveled together to Egypt, spent countless hours discussing archaeological theory, collaborated on half a dozen major expeditions. I think I can safely say I would recognize his voice under any circumstances. But as I studied Lord Pemberton's face, I noticed something that troubled me. Despite his confident words, there was a slight hesitation in his manner, a flicker of uncertainty that suggested he might not be as certain as he claimed. Lord Pemberton, I need to ask you about the artifacts that Professor Blackthorne brought back from your recent expedition. Dr. Fairfax mentioned papyrus scrolls, jewelry, and a sealed canopic jar. Have you examined these items personally? Some of them, certainly. The expedition was funded by my foundation, so I have a legitimate interest in cataloging the discoveries. Blackthorne was preparing a full inventory for the museum's records. And in your opinion, are all of these artifacts authentic? The question clearly caught him off guard. He set down the photograph he had been holding and looked at me with a mixture of surprise and concern. Inspector, are you suggesting that Edmund Blackthorne might have been involved in some kind of fraud? That's absolutely preposterous. His scholarly integrity was beyond question, but the more emphatically Lord Pemberton defended Professor Blackthorne's reputation, the more convinced I became that there were secrets hidden beneath the surface of this case. The golden amulet I had found in the study, the impossible timeline of the murder, the elaborate security surrounding the professor's private collection, all of it suggested a conspiracy more complex than a simple academic dispute. Lord Pemberton, I'd like to examine the artifacts from your Egyptian expedition. Would it be possible to view them here at the museum? I'm afraid most of them are still at Blackthorne's house, Inspector. The formal transfer to the museum wasn't scheduled to take place until next week. However, I do have some preliminary photographs and documentation here in my office. He produced a folder containing dozens of black and white photographs showing various Egyptian artifacts arranged for cataloging. The images were professional quality, clearly taken by someone with museum-level expertise in archaeological documentation. But as I studied the photographs more carefully, I began to notice inconsistencies that troubled me. Several of the artifacts appeared in multiple photographs with slightly different appearances, as if they had been modified or altered between photo sessions. Then the golden amulet I had found in Professor Blackthorne's study appeared in one of the photographs, labeled as 5th Dynasty ceremonial piece, authentication pending. Lord Pemberton, this amulet here, when was this photograph taken? He examined the image closely. Last week, I believe. Blackthorne was still completing his preliminary analysis of the smaller artifacts. And where is this particular piece now? It should be with the rest of the collection at Blackthorne's house. Why do you ask? I showed him the amulet I had found at the crime scene. Because I found this on the floor of Professor Blackthorne's study, and I have reason to believe it may not be as ancient as it appears. Lord Pemberton's face went pale as he realized the implications of what I was suggesting. If the artifacts from their Egyptian expedition were forgeries, or if authentic pieces were being replaced with fakes, the scandal would destroy not only his reputation, but also the credibility of the British Museum's entire Egyptian collection. Here's what we know so far. A murdered archaeologist who appeared to be alive after his death, artifacts that may not be what they seem, and a wealthy patron whose expedition may have uncovered more than just ancient treasures. What if the real treasure wasn't in Egypt at all, but in London, in the form of a forgery operation that could fool even the world's leading experts? The revelation that the artifacts might be forgeries cast the entire case in a new light. If Professor Blackthorne had discovered that someone was systematically replacing authentic Egyptian treasures with expertly crafted fakes, he would have been in a position to expose a conspiracy worth millions of pounds, and that would provide a powerful motive for murder. But it still didn't explain the impossible timeline. How could Professor Blackthorne appear to be alive and speaking on the telephone 30 minutes after his death? The answer, I realized, might lie not in supernatural explanations but in the mundane details of modern technology and human psychology. Lord Pemberton, I said, I need to examine Professor Blackthorne's telephone system. You mentioned that you called at 5 minutes to midnight and spoke with him directly. Yes, Inspector. I telephoned from my home in Belgravia. The conversation lasted perhaps 10 minutes. And you're certain you were speaking directly with Professor Blackthorne, not with someone else in his household? Absolutely certain. We discussed specific details of the papyrus translations that only Blackthorne would have known. But as I considered the technical aspects of the situation, I began to formulate a theory that might explain the impossible timeline. Professor Blackthorne's house was equipped with a speaking tube system, connecting his study with the library downstairs, a common feature in Victorian houses that allowed communication between floors without the need to physically move between rooms. What if the murderer had used this system to create the illusion that Professor Blackthorne was still alive? What if someone with intimate knowledge of the professor's work and mannerisms had hidden in the house after committing the murder, then used the speaking tube and telephone system to impersonate him? I returned to Russell Square that evening to test my theory. Dr. Fairfax met me at the door, her face drawn with exhaustion and grief. Inspector, have you made any progress in understanding what happened to Professor Blackthorne? I believe I'm beginning to understand the method, Dr. Fairfax. I need to examine the house's communication systems more carefully. She led me to the library, where the speaking tube terminus was located. The system was indeed elaborate, a network of brass tubes connecting the study, library, kitchen, and several other rooms throughout the house. But more importantly, I noticed that the speaking tube could be connected to the telephone system through a mechanical switch arrangement that would allow someone in the library to participate in telephone conversations originating in the study. Dr. Fairfax, who else has access to this house? Who would be familiar with Professor Blackthorne's daily routines and communication systems? Very few people, Inspector. There's Mrs. Henderson, who comes in 3 times a week to clean and prepare meals. Mr. Ashford, who maintains the artifact collections and assists with cataloging. And of course the various scholars and collectors who visit regularly to consult with Professor Blackthorne. What about Mr. Ashford? How well does he know Professor Blackthorne's work? Extremely well. He's been assisting the professor for nearly 8 years. Ever since returning from military service in France, he has an excellent knowledge of Egyptian history and is skilled at handling delicate artifacts. And where was Mr. Ashford last night? Dr. Fairfax paused, her expression growing troubled. I'm not entirely certain, Inspector. He usually leaves by 6 o'clock in the evening, but I know he sometimes returns in the evenings to work on special projects. Mr. Ashford, a man with intimate knowledge of Professor Blackthorne's collection, access to the house, and expertise in handling Egyptian artifacts. If he had discovered the forgery operation, or if he was involved in it himself, he would have both motive and opportunity for murder. Dr. Fairfax, I need to speak with Mr. Ashford immediately. Where can I find him? He lives in a small flat in Holborn, Inspector, but he should be here tomorrow morning. We were supposed to continue cataloging the expedition artifacts, but I had no intention of waiting until morning. If my theory was correct, Mr. Ashford had committed an elaborate murder designed to create an impossible timeline that would confuse the investigation and provide him with the perfect alibi. But like all clever criminals, he had made one crucial mistake. He had assumed that the technical aspects of his deception would be too complex for a simple police detective to understand. We found Charles Ashford at his modest flat in Lamb's Conduit Street, a thin, nervous man of perhaps 35, with the pale complexion and careful hands of someone who spent his time handling delicate objects. He answered the door in his dressing gown, clearly surprised to receive visitors so late in the evening. "Mr. Ashford," I said, showing my warrant card, "I'm Inspector Hartley, investigating the death of Professor Blackthorne. I need to ask you some questions about last night." His face went pale, but he invited us into his small sitting room, which was furnished with the kind of modest furniture that suggested a man living on a scholar's salary. But what caught my attention immediately were the books lining the walls, not just works on Egyptian history, but technical manuals on metalworking, chemistry, and art restoration. "Mr. Ashford," I said, settling into a worn armchair, "where were you between 11 and midnight last night?" "Here, Inspector. I was reading in preparation for today's cataloging work. We were supposed to examine some papyrus fragments that required special handling techniques. Can anyone verify your whereabouts?" "I'm afraid not, Inspector. I live alone, and I rarely receive visitors in the evenings." But as I studied his nervous manner and evasive answers, I became more convinced that Charles Ashford was our murderer. He had the knowledge, the opportunity, and access to the equipment necessary to create both the forgeries and the elaborate deception around Professor Blackthorne's time of death. "Mr. Ashford, I'm going to ask you about something that may seem unusual. Are you familiar with the speaking tube system in Professor Blackthorne's house?" The question clearly caught him off guard. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for a glass of water, and I could see perspiration forming on his forehead despite the cool evening air. "Yes, Inspector. Professor Blackthorne used it to communicate with the library and other rooms when he didn't want to be interrupted during his research." "And you would be familiar with the professor's voice and manner of speaking?" "Certainly. I worked closely with him for 8 years. I could recognize his voice and speech patterns quite easily." "What about imitating his voice, Mr. Ashford? Would that be possible for someone with your knowledge of his mannerisms?" He set down the water glass with shaking hands, and I could see that my questions were hitting their mark. Charles Ashford was beginning to realize that his elaborate deception had been uncovered. This is the moment when a criminal's carefully constructed alibi begins to crumble. Ashford thought he had created the perfect murder, killing Professor Blackthorne at 11:30. Then using the speaking tube and telephone systems to make it appear the professor was still alive at midnight. But he hadn't counted on a detective who understood both human nature and Victorian technology. "Mr. Ashford," I continued, "I believe you killed Professor Blackthorne at approximately 11:30 p.m., then used your knowledge of his communication systems to create the illusion that he was still alive when Lord Pemberton called at midnight." His face crumpled as the weight of accusation settled upon him. For a moment I thought he might continue to deny everything, but then his shoulders sagged in defeat. "How did you know?" he asked quietly. "Several things gave you away," I explained. "First, your extensive knowledge of metalworking and chemistry skills that would be essential for creating convincing forgeries of Egyptian artifacts. Second, your intimate familiarity with Professor Blackthorne's voice and mannerisms, which would allow you to impersonate him convincingly over the telephone and speaking tube systems. But most importantly, you made one crucial technical error. When you spoke to Lord Pemberton while impersonating Professor Blackthorne, you used the mechanical connection between the speaking tube and telephone systems, but that connection creates a slight echo and delay that wouldn't be present if someone was actually speaking from the study telephone. Lord Pemberton heard it, but didn't consciously recognize what it meant, but it told me that the call wasn't originating from where it appeared to be." Ashford looked up at me with a mixture of admiration and despair. "You're quite clever, Inspector. I thought that detail was too subtle to be noticed. Now I need you to tell me why you killed Professor Blackthorne. Was it because he discovered your forgery operation?" "Not exactly," Ashford said, his voice barely above a whisper. Professor Blackthorne knew about the forgeries. He was part of them. This revelation surprised me. I had assumed that Professor Blackthorne was an innocent victim who had discovered the conspiracy and been killed to protect it. But if he was actually involved in the forgery operation, explain that, Mr. Ashford. It started 3 years ago, he said, settling back in his chair with the relief of someone finally able to confess a long-held secret. Professor Blackthorne had mounting debts from his expeditions, and Lord Pemberton was becoming increasingly demanding about returns on his investments. They conceived a plan to create extremely high-quality reproductions of minor artifacts, then sell the originals privately while displaying the copies in the museum. And your role was to create these reproductions. I had the technical skills, and Professor Blackthorne provided the scholarly expertise to ensure historical accuracy. We were very careful to choose pieces that weren't well documented, items that could disappear from the official records without raising suspicions. Then why did you kill him? Ashford's face hardened as he recalled whatever had driven him to murder. Because Professor Blackthorne became greedy. We had agreed to limit ourselves to minor pieces, items worth a few £100 each. But then he discovered the location of Ankh-Toy's tomb, the lost tomb that Dr. Fairfax had mentioned. If Professor Blackthorne had actually found an undiscovered burial site containing treasures that could rival Tutankhamun's tomb, the financial stakes would have been astronomical. Professor Blackthorne wanted to organize a legitimate expedition to excavate the tomb, then secretly remove the most valuable artifacts before the official cataloging began. We would create perfect reproductions to replace them, and the originals would be sold privately to collectors who wouldn't ask questions about their provenance. But you objected to this plan. Inspector, we're talking about artifacts worth millions of pounds, pieces that belonged in museums, not in private collections. Professor Blackthorne had lost sight of everything except profit. He was willing to rob humanity of irreplaceable historical treasures for his own financial gain. It was a curious form of honor among thieves. Ashford was willing to steal minor artifacts for modest profit, but he drew the line at major historical fraud. But his moral scruples, however genuine, didn't justify murder, so you decided to kill him to prevent the tomb robbery. I tried to reason with him, Inspector. I went to his house last night to convince him to abandon the plan, but he refused to listen. He said the debt collectors were closing in, and this was his only chance to save himself financially. And then, we argued in his study. Professor Blackthorne became angry and threatened to expose my involvement in the forgery operation if I didn't cooperate with his tomb robbery plan. He reached for his telephone to call the police, and I grabbed the ceremonial dagger from his desk and stabbed him. But you didn't flee immediately. You stayed to create the alibi. I panicked at first, but then I realized that I could use the communication systems to create confusion about the time of death. I knew Lord Pemberton would be calling at midnight. They had arranged the appointment during dinner yesterday evening, so you hid in the library and used the speaking tube to impersonate Professor Blackthorne when Dr. Fairfax called up to him, then connected the telephone system to continue the impersonation during Lord Pemberton's call. It seemed like the perfect plan, Ashford admitted. If I could make it appear that Professor Blackthorne was alive at midnight, no one would suspect that I had killed him at 11:30 and then left the house. But perfect plans, I had learned, usually contained the seeds of their own destruction. Ashford's technical knowledge had allowed him to create an elaborate deception, but his own conscience had ultimately betrayed him. He could create convincing forgeries and manipulate communication systems, but he couldn't escape the moral weight of murder. Think about this final twist: a man killed to prevent a greater crime by someone who was already committing a lesser one. Ashford's moral calculations led him to murder, but they also led him to confession. Sometimes the most complex mysteries have the simplest explanations: human greed, human conscience, and the technology we use to deceive each other and ourselves. The trial of Charles Ashford became a sensation in London's academic and social circles, exposing not only a murder, but a sophisticated art forgery operation that had been operating for years under the noses of the world's leading experts. The scandal rocked the British Museum and led to significant changes in how archaeological discoveries were catalogued and authenticated. Ashford was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment, though he served only 15 years before being released for good behavior. His technical skills proved valuable even in prison, where he taught metalworking and restoration techniques to other inmates. Lord Pemberton, though cleared of any involvement in the forgery operation, found his reputation severely damaged by the revelation that his expeditions had been used as cover for criminal activity. He retired from public life and devoted his remaining years to legitimate charitable work. Dr. Fairfax inherited Professor Blackthorne's legitimate collection and used it as the foundation for a new research institute dedicated to ethical archaeological practices. She became one of Britain's leading experts on art authentication and spent her career developing techniques to detect forgeries and protect historical artifacts from criminal exploitation. But perhaps the most significant outcome of the case was what it revealed about the intersection of technology, expertise, and criminal deception. Ashford's ability to manipulate Victorian communication systems to create an impossible timeline showed how even seemingly simple technology could be used in sophisticated ways by someone with the right knowledge and motivation. The case also highlighted the moral complexities that can arise when personal ethics conflict with professional obligations. Ashford genuinely believed he was preventing a greater crime by committing murder, but his noble motivations couldn't justify his criminal actions. Sometimes the most dangerous criminals are those who believe their crimes serve a higher purpose. As for the lost tomb of Ankh-Tawi, Professor Blackthorne's notes were eventually used to organize a legitimate expedition that discovered one of the most significant archaeological finds of the 20th century. The tomb contained not only vast treasures, but also papyrus scrolls that revolutionized our understanding of ancient Egyptian mathematics and astronomy. But every artifact was carefully catalogued, authenticated, and placed in museums where they could be studied by scholars and enjoyed by the public. The treasures that Professor Blackthorne had been willing to steal for personal profit became part of humanity's shared heritage, exactly as they should have been. The case taught me important lessons about the relationship between knowledge and responsibility. Expertise can be used for criminal purposes just as easily as for legitimate ones, and the same skills that allow someone to preserve and understand history can also be used to falsify and exploit it. Perhaps most importantly, I learned that the most sophisticated criminal plans often contain within them the mechanisms of their own destruction. Ashford's technical brilliance allowed him to create an elaborate deception, but his human conscience ultimately compelled him to confess. In the end, it wasn't superior detective work that solved the case. It was the killer's own moral awakening to the enormity of what he had done. And that, my friends, was how we solved the case of the archaeologist's lost tomb, a murder that seemed to defy time itself, until we understood that the killer had used Victorian technology to manipulate our perception of when the crime occurred. Charles Ashford's plan was brilliant in its technical execution, but fatally flawed in its moral foundation. The case demonstrated that even the most impossible crimes can be solved through careful observation, logical deduction, and an understanding of both human nature and the technologies that shape our daily lives. Ashford thought he could use his expertise to create the perfect alibi, but he forgot that knowledge can be turned against its user when conscience comes into play. What did you think of today's mystery? Did you suspect that the impossible timeline was created through technological deception? Could you have solved the case before Inspector Hartley revealed the truth about the speaking tube system? Let me know in the comments below. I always enjoy hearing your theories and deductions. Most importantly, what did this case teach you about the relationship between expertise and ethics? How do we ensure that specialized knowledge is used for legitimate purposes rather than criminal ones? These are questions that become more important as our technologies become more sophisticated and our world becomes more complex. Don't forget to subscribe to Detective Stories audiobooks for a new mystery every single day. Tomorrow, we'll be investigating a case that takes us into the world of London's exclusive gentlemen's clubs, where a game of cards leads to murder and a secret that threatens to destroy one of Britain's oldest institutions. Until then, remember that truth has a way of revealing itself, even when it's been buried beneath layers of deception and technological trickery. The ancient Egyptians believed that truth was the foundation of cosmic order, and that those who violated it would ultimately face justice. In Charles Ashford's case, they were absolutely right.
This has been Detective Stories audiobooks, where every mystery teaches us something new about human nature, criminal psychology, and the endless ingenuity of both those who break the law and those who enforce it. Subscribe, and I'll see you tomorrow for another case that will challenge your assumptions about what's possible and what's impossible in the world of crime. Remember, in the world of detective fiction, as in real life, the most impossible things often have the simplest explanations. You just have to know where to look for them.